Hi everybody, thank you for joining us today, and I'm in Ottawa, so it's not morning for me, it's middle of the hour starting to. I wanted to talk, I was asked to talk about Métis family histories, and so some of the work that I do. And I start with traditional stories, and there's all kinds of traditional stories about marriages between humans and animals. This particular book, The Man Who Married a Beaver, was just published by the Labrador Institute in partnership with the Indigenous Nation in Labrador. And there are lots of stories that involve human and bear marriages, marriages to dogs, and all sorts of stories about animal-human adoptions. And these stories interest me because I think they set in place a foundation for how people are supposed to relate and interact with one another. So the story I'm most familiar with is The Woman Who Married a Beaver. It's a Cree and Ojibwe story, and just in brief, it's a story that details the history of a woman who fell in love with a young man who convinced her to come and live with him, and in return, all that he asked from her would be that her loyalty. He would supply her with everything that she could ever imagine: food, clothing, security, and they would have a happy life and children together, and she agreed. And so they went and lived together, and they had children together, and she occasionally noticed some odd behavior. Her husband and her children would leave at certain times of the year. When they came home, they would come home loaded with all kinds of gifts, but they were generally happy, and everyone got along, and eventually her children got married and moved away, and her husband subsequently died, and she was left alone in her home, and she was starting to consider what to do next, who to be, and she heard the voices of people one day outside of her home, and so she called to them, and they came, and they broke through her lodge and pulled her out, and it was really at that point that she discovered or realized that she had spent her entire life living amongst the beaver and learning from the beaver what it meant to be a good relative. And so it became her responsibility then to take those teachings about how to be a good relative back to her own people, to talk to them about their responsibility towards the beaver, but also their responsibilities towards each other. And so she carried with her this perception of relatedness and how to be a good relative. And so the teachings that I work with are really around the notion of all my relations as a worldview that is particular to Indigenous societies. These stories, like The Woman Who Married a Beaver, are really representative of traditional values and teachings about how to be a human being. And so as such, they represent a particular kind of worldview, a unique way of looking out at the world. So everybody has family. Of course, I'm not saying that other nations or societies don't have conceptions of families, but this is about constructing notions of relatedness in a unique or particular kind of way of life. And so the work that I've done is around what Sioux scholar Beatrice Medicine called the reciprocal family model, when your responsibility is to ensure that people have the things in life that they need, and in return they will help you when you need that kind of help. And so this reciprocity, this value of reciprocity, is to keep goodwill circulating between people. Elle expliquera, another Sioux scholar, described the Stereotypes as another form of a worldview, but how to be a human being. The very thing that defined Indigenous people, and in her case the Sioux, was their effort to make and keep and maintain family over time, that is the very essence or definition of being a human being, and that the responsibility that relatives have to one another is more important than a rights-based discourse. So to always think of your relatives first, how to think of how you support and maintain those relationships to each other, and then this is the basis of who we are. And then, of course, making sure that there is respect, not just for one another, certainly not for the people in your immediate family, but for all of those people that you have made relationships with. And, of course, as we learn from the story of The Woman Who Married a Beaver, from the animals to the animals themselves, that they are a part of this kinscape that we construct for ourselves. And so these were the kinds of values that people learned when they were children. They were told these kinds of stories over and over again, and become foundational to who we are, and certainly who we were historically. And so I take those stories and then I start to, I work with archival documents, and so I wanted to see how in historical records people described or related themselves within a system of family. And I have several examples to show you. This one comes from 1887. A Métis man by the name of Raphael Morin was applying for scrip, which is an application process for land, and so he had to answer a series of questions. But one of the questions is, where are you from? Where are you born? And he answers quite succinctly, and I won't read it to you, but I come from the place where my mother comes from. My father's people are far away, but I was born and raised in the place where my mother's people are. And so it struck me that he's very clearly articulating cultural and a social space, maybe even a political space, that is invested in his maternal relations. So his mother was a woman by the name of Pélagie Boucher, married Antoine Morin. Antoine Morin was from Quebec, and Pélagie was born in the Lalache region, which you will have been hearing about on the news in the last few days, in the late 1700s. And she raised upwards of 13 children of this region, all of whom went on to raise their own families here. So I start to work with genealogies as a way to reconstruct these kinds of narratives. Another example is Johnny Grant, a man who was born at Fort Edmonton, which is the photograph that you see on the side there. Grant was born in the early 1800s at Fort Edmonton, and yet lived his life all over the Northern Plains as an entrepreneur. And in 1889, just a few years after Morin, he comes back to the Fort Edmonton region, which is now turning into the city of Edmonton. And he's trying to think of a place for his family to finally settle down, for him to live out the remainder of his life. And this is the first time that he's been in the Edmonton region since about 1834, when he was a young man. And of course, he much like Morin, he talks about the place where he's from. He says that he writes to his wife to tell her to come to this place, because he's never seen as fine a home as the place where he was born, and this is where he would like to live. And so again, it's an articulation of identity based in space, but also connected to systems of land as well as to systems of family that I find so interesting. And the thing about Métis history, if you've taken it or if you research it, it's often very male-dominated. Of course, I've given you the example of two men speaking or recording their thoughts. But in general, Canadian history about Métis people is very stereotypical around masculinity and around the masculine ideals. And so we've got hunters and voyageurs and cours de bois, freighters, traders, and of course warriors. You know, these are people who went to war against the Canadian state and were subsequently defeated in 1885 at Batoche, but until then had been quite successful in controlling their environment as much as possible. But in all of these stories, I had to ask myself, where are the women? You know, we have Morin and Johnny Grant who are talking about the space that their maternal relatives come from, and so where are the women in these narratives, in these stories? And so I've gone in search of women. And so this is Madeleine Laframboise. The Laframboise family is across the Métis homeland. There are various branches of it. They're it's a well-known name in our communities. Madeleine, however, was born at Michilimackinac. She married a trader by the name of Laframboise, and after he was murdered, she went on to run his trading empire, or what had been the beginnings of his trading empire, and became one of the most well-connected women across the southern Great Lakes. She only had 2 children, but her son Joseph went on to be the grandparent, then the grandfather, of all of the families that we see spread across the Métis homeland who have that surname. And this is her house in Michilimackinac that she eventually built for herself, which really does speak to the power that she had as a trader herself. And then I also was introduced very early on in my research to Charlotte and Nancy Small, two sisters who were born at Ile-la-Crosse in the late 18th century. Ile-la-Crosse is in northern Saskatchewan. What's remarkable about these two sisters is not who they married. And by way of disclosure then, Charlotte Small was the wife of trader and cartographer David Thompson, and Nancy Small married another prominent fur trader by the name of John MacDonald of Garth. These two men were Northwest Company employees. They worked together much of their adult lives. They married sisters, and those sisters traveled with their husbands to various fur posts. They were often not together, but at the same time managed to come together in their older years at a town called Williamstown, Ontario, which is just outside of Cornwall, Ontario, by the mid-19th century, and they both end up raising the remainder of their children in Williamstown, spending all of their time together, and those families are still there as well. And that house in the photograph there is Nancy Small's house, very similar in many respects to the Laframboise house in the Great Lakes. And so as I trace women, I start to see several key kinds of patterns that start with Madeleine Laframboise, but also reflected in the lives of the Small sisters. And what I've been learning about really through historical documents are these sister communities, that women are responsible for bringing together unrelated fur traders who work together, who associate with one another, but otherwise have no family connection to one another. And instead what we have are a series of sisters who create the places that we understand to be central to the Métis homeland and experience. So we have the Small sisters in Williamstown, we have the three Bottineau sisters in the Qu'Appelle Valley, we have three McGillis sisters in Willowbunch, Saskatchewan, we have three Laframboise sisters and one aunt at Round Prairie, Saskatchewan. What's interesting from my perspective is these women have essentially been written out of history because they are not themselves necessarily fur traders, with the exception of Madeleine Laframboise. And so people talk about the men that are associated with them and around them, but often what I hear people say is, well, we don't know who the women are and we can't trace them. We absolutely can trace them. We can trace them well back into the late 1700s. We just need to make the effort to actually do that. And so one of the newer approaches I'm taking is to try and understand the role of godmothers. And I've created an idea here that there are godmothers to the nation. There are specific women in specific regions who turn up over and over and over again in church records as having been the godmother to generations of children. And so we know within the Catholic Church that to be a godparent is to literally take on the role of parent should something happen to those children. If you have 100 godchildren, it's hard to imagine how that's possible, except that what you're actually doing is building this wider network of relatives. You're extending your kinship relations outwards. And so kinship in a Métis worldview, and certainly in a broader Indigenous worldview, is not who in fact you're biologically related to. It is who you extend that kinship relationship to. So it's your aunts and uncles, but it's also what anthropologists would call fictive relations, those people that you adopt or that you tie yourself to in some obvious way. And within an Aboriginal worldview, this isn't fiction at all. The very moment that you do this, you create a new relative, and so you extend your kinscape far and wide. And so these are the things that interest me, and I think that studying families as a basis of our worldview, by going back into those traditional stories about human and beaver marriages or just human and animal relationships, we start to write ourselves back into history, but we also especially start to write women back into our history and to not presume that they're not present for all of it. And so this is knowing who you are. This is critical to knowing who you are. It's critical to your well-being. The sash, of course, is always used as a representative of masculine identity. We know that. But we also have the other elements that represent women, and so I included this piece of silk embroidery at the bottom because it's equally as indicative of who Métis people are. These are the things that we need to teach our children about. Anybody who's been through the education system knows that you don't learn local history in school. You don't learn your community's history in school. And yet, the question is, why not? Why are we learning larger international and national histories at the expense of knowing our own intimate experiences? And for Aboriginal communities in particular, this is so important, coming out of the transitioning out of the history of residential schools, but also trying to rebuild families in the wake of the foster child system, and bringing our families and our communities back together by telling these stories and by recreating and restructuring our family histories in this way. And so family is very much a social determinant of health. It is the very security of every person comes from the family unit. But it's not simply a matter of understanding a construction of family in that nuclear family construct, 2 parents and 2 to 3 children, but as a community coming back together as a family and re-grounding ourselves in those traditions for young people today, but also for the health of ourselves as adults. I think it's just so critical. And so that's really what I wanted to share with you today, and to also say, quite frankly, that these things aren't lost to us. We just have to go in search of them and to find them, and then bring those things back into our political discourses as we talk about rights, as we talk about health, as we talk about where we're going to go in the future. This has to be a part of that narrative. And so that's all I really had to say, and so I am going to turn it over to Brody now.